The Phantom Hitchhiker in the Rocky Mountains. I was driving my usual route through the Rocky Mountains, a stretch I'd done countless times, but that night, something felt off. It was cold, and the fog was thicker than usual, hanging low on the winding road. The type of fog that makes you question what's real or just a shadow in the mist. I had the radio on low, static mostly, just to break the silence, when I spotted a figure by the side of the road. He was standing there, barely visible through the fog, with one arm out, thumb up, hitchhiking. But this wasn't the usual type of hitchhiker you see in towns or at gas stations. This guy looked wrong. He was pale, clothes smudged with something dark, maybe blood. His eyes were glazed over, unfocused, staring right through me as I approached. I don't usually pick up hitchhikers, and definitely not in the middle of nowhere, but the sight of him sent a chill down my spine. Part of me thought he might be hurt, maybe been in an accident and needed help. I slowed down a bit, thinking of calling it in rather than stopping. But just as I was about to reach for my phone, the guy vanished. I blinked, thought maybe I imagined it. My heart was racing as I scanned the road, but there was nothing, just more fog and the quiet of the mountains. I shook it off, muttering to myself about seeing things, until my CB radio crackled to life. Static, hissing, louder than usual, and then a voice. Low, distorted, like it was coming from far away, but unmistakable. It said my name. Hearing my own name through the CB radio like that, it's hard to describe how much it rattled me. I hadn't told anyone where I was, and it's not like I was expecting company on that channel. My heart started pounding, and I quickly glanced around the cab, almost like expecting to see someone there. But of course, it was just me, alone in that massive truck. I tried to ignore the radio, but something made me look into my side mirror, just for a second. That's when I saw him. Standing there, impossibly close to the side of the truck, was the same hitchhiker, just standing still, looking right at me with that blank, empty stare. I slammed on the gas, instinct taking over. My hands were shaking on the wheel, eyes flicking from the road to the mirrors, hoping he'd be gone. But even as I sped up, his figure stayed in the mirror for a while, like he was somehow keeping up with the truck. I kept muttering, trying to calm myself down, but nothing was making sense. Finally, after what felt like forever, I couldn't see him anymore. The mirror just showed empty road and fog behind me. I forced myself to take a deep breath, trying to convince myself it was just a trick of the light or the fog messing with my head. But every time I glanced at the mirror again, I felt that same dread creeping back up, like he could reappear at any moment. I kept driving, gripping the wheel so hard my knuckles were white. My mind was racing, trying to make sense of what just happened, but there was nothing logical about it. I couldn't shake the feeling that he was still with me somehow, lurking just out of sight. The CB radio crackled again, and my stomach dropped. I didn't want to hear that voice again, but I couldn't ignore it either. I turned the volume down, hoping it would stay quiet, but after a few moments of static, I heard breathing, slow, labored breathing, like someone struggling. Then came that distorted voice again, whispering my name, dragging it out like a taunt. It was like he knew I was trying to ignore him, and he wanted to make sure I knew he was still there. I wanted to pull over, just stop and get out of the truck, maybe even abandon it altogether if I had to. But something told me stopping would be a mistake. So I kept going, trying to block out the voice, the sounds, everything. I kept glancing in my side mirror, expecting to see him any second. And then, for just a split second, I did. He was there, close to the cab, like he was clinging to the side of the truck, his face half hidden in shadow. I could see the outline of his face, still bloody, eyes empty as ever, staring right at me. I looked away, my pulse racing, refusing to look again. When I finally gathered the courage to check the mirror, he was gone. But the dread stayed with me, filling the truck like a presence I couldn't escape. I drove like that for miles, barely breathing, constantly scanning the mirrors and checking the CB radio. My hands were shaking, my whole body tense. It was like every shadow on the road, every flicker of fog, was him, waiting to appear again. The radio would crackle now and then, static breaking the silence, but I kept the volume low, hoping I wouldn't hear his voice again. But then, just as I was starting to think I might be in the clear, the radio burst to life with a sound that was unmistakable. A slow, deliberate tapping, like someone knocking from the outside of the truck, right by the passenger door. I nearly swerved off the road, trying to look over without actually wanting to see. There was no one there, just fog and the empty road, but the tapping continued, steady and impossible to ignore. I couldn't take it anymore. I turned the radio off, hoping that would stop whatever was happening. But the silence only made it worse. Without the radio, every sound around me felt amplified. I could swear I heard footsteps just outside the cab, pacing along the side, matching my speed, like he was still there, following me. I kept my eyes glued to the road, determined not to look in the mirrors anymore, but it felt like he was everywhere, closing in, even though I couldn't see him. Finally, I saw the lights of a rest area up ahead, a small pull-off spot with just a couple of lamps glowing through the fog. I felt a wave of relief wash over me, thinking maybe I could stop for a second, get out, clear my head, and just shake off whatever was happening. I pulled in, parked under the brightest light I could find, and sat there for a minute, letting the engine hum in the quiet. It was the first moment of calm I'd had since spotting that hitchhiker. I kept telling myself it was all just stress, maybe even exhaustion messing with me. But just as I was starting to feel a sliver of peace, there it was, a shadow moving at the edge of the fog, stepping slowly toward the truck. I didn't want to believe it, but there was no denying it. He was back, that same blank stare and bloody clothes, standing just outside the light's reach, half hidden in the fog. I could feel his gaze fixed on me, even from that distance. I locked the doors instinctively, even though I knew it wouldn't do much. My heart was hammering, and I could barely breathe. I don't know how long we stayed like that. Me frozen in the cab, him standing just far enough away that I could barely make out his features. But eventually, he took a step back, disappearing back into the fog, like he'd decided to let me go. I didn't wait to find out if he'd come back. I slammed the truck into gear and sped off, not looking back, not slowing down until I was miles away from that spot. Even now, I can't shake the feeling he's still out there, somewhere on that mountain road, waiting for the next driver to pass by. The vanishing passenger in a snowstorm. I'd been on the road for hours that night, barely able to see more than a few feet in front of me through the thick snowstorm. The wind was howling, blowing snow sideways, and even with the heat cranked up in the cab, it felt like the cold was seeping right through the metal of my truck. I was exhausted and just trying to make it to the next rest stop, when suddenly, I saw this shadowy figure on the side of the road. At first, I thought I was seeing things, but as I got closer, I realized it was a woman, standing next to a beat-up car that was half buried in snow, waving her arms like crazy. She looked desperate, and I didn't have it in me to just keep driving. I pulled over and motioned for her to get in. She climbed up into the cab, looking grateful but shivering like she'd been out there forever. She was bundled up, but her face was pale, and her eyes were wide like she'd just seen something awful. I asked her what happened, and she explained in this shaky voice that her car had broken down, and she'd been stuck for what felt like hours. She didn't go into much detail, but she kept glancing back at her car, like she didn't want to leave it. I tried to reassure her, telling her that she was safe now and that I'd get her to the next town so she could warm up and call for help. She nodded, looking relieved, and I focused back on the road, squinting through the storm. It was so quiet in the cab, only the hum of the engine and the relentless sound of snow hitting the windshield. I thought about asking her more questions, maybe about her name or where she was headed, but I felt like she just needed a moment to calm down, so I kept driving in silence. But then, after only a couple of minutes, I glanced over, and she was gone. The seat beside me was completely empty, like she'd never been there at all. I remember staring at the passenger door, thinking maybe she'd somehow opened it and jumped out, but the door was still shut tight, and there was no way she could have left without me hearing it. I felt a chill run through me, colder than the snow outside. I actually pulled over again, trying to process what I'd just seen, or hadn't seen. I even looked in the back of the cab, thinking maybe she'd somehow moved, but there was nothing, just my stuff, untouched. I sat there for a few minutes, my heart pounding, trying to convince myself that I'd just imagined it. Maybe I was more tired than I thought, and my mind was playing tricks on me. The storm outside was brutal, and exhaustion can mess with your head in ways you wouldn't believe. So finally, I pulled myself together, telling myself it was just a hallucination. I took a deep breath, turned on the radio to calm my nerves, and got back on the road. But I couldn't shake the feeling of her sitting there, the way she'd looked at me, desperate and afraid. It felt too real. When I finally made it to a small truck stop a few miles up the road, I parked and tried to brush the whole thing off. I went to grab my thermos from the passenger seat, and that's when I noticed it, a single, small glove lying on the seat. It hadn't been there before. It was this pale, knitted glove, too delicate to be anything I'd ever owned. My stomach dropped. I could still feel the fabric was cold, like it had been sitting in the freezing air outside. I stared at that glove, my mind racing, trying to come up with any rational explanation. Maybe she'd left it behind when she got in, but then, how did she disappear? I picked it up, almost expecting it to vanish in my hand, but it was solid, real. I sat there, gripping the steering wheel, feeling an icy sweat start to form on the back of my neck. That's when I looked over at the passenger side window and saw it, a message, scratched faintly into the fogged-up glass. Just 2 words, "Thanks for the ride." My hands started shaking, and I could feel my chest tighten. I kept staring at the words, trying to figure out how they got there. I hadn't heard a thing, hadn't seen her move, nothing. I thought about wiping the message off, but I felt frozen, like I was in some kind of dream that I couldn't wake up from. Eventually, I forced myself to get out of the truck, just needing some fresh air to clear my head. The snow was still coming down hard, covering everything in this thick, quiet blanket. But even outside, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. I walked around to the passenger side, half expecting to see her tracks in the snow leading away from the truck. But there was nothing, just my own footprints from getting out. It was as if she'd never even been there. I got back into the cab, my hands still cold and shaking, and decided I needed to keep moving. The whole drive, I couldn't stop glancing over at that empty seat, half expecting her to reappear or to hear her voice again. When I finally reached my drop-off point, I asked a few of the guys at the depot if they'd ever heard of anything like this happening. One of them just stared at me, quiet, then told me I wasn't the first driver to pick up a vanishing passenger on that stretch of road. Apparently, people had been seeing her for years. Hearing that sent a chill down my spine, more intense than the cold outside. The guy didn't say much else, just kind of nodded, like he understood but didn't want to talk about it anymore. After that, I kept replaying every second in my head, the way she looked, the glove, those words scratched on the window. I couldn't shake the feeling that I'd crossed paths with something I wasn't supposed to understand. It was like she was reaching out. But for what? Help? Some kind of closure? To this day, I haven't been able to shake that night. Every time I drive down that stretch of road, especially when it's snowing, I catch myself scanning the side, half expecting to see her there, waving for help again. And every winter, that glove still sits in my glove box, a reminder of the one ride I'll never be able to explain. I still can't decide if I met a ghost or something far stranger, and I don't think I ever will. Suspicious help request on a remote road. I was halfway through a midnight haul across a long, empty stretch of Texas when I first spotted it. A beat-up old car with its hazards blinking on the side of the road. It was one of those nights where the silence felt heavy, pressing in through the truck windows, and the road was dead still. There's this unspoken rule out here, you know, among drivers. If you see someone stranded, you stop and help. We're all each other's lifeline on these stretches, so I started to slow down. But something about the way that car was parked didn't sit right with me. It was angled weirdly, almost like someone had just swerved and left it there. Then I saw him, this guy waving his arms, looking panicked but also off. It wasn't the usual hand wave of someone needing a quick favor or a jump. It was frantic, yet calculated, like he was just trying to get me to stop. I kept my doors locked but rolled down the passenger window just a bit, enough to hear him out but not enough for him to reach inside. Before I could even ask what was wrong, he stepped closer, his face lined and wild, looking under the dim glow of my headlights. He said his wife was trapped under the car and that he needed help to lift it. I remember feeling this immediate chill. Why didn't he call for emergency services? And why was she under the car to begin with? As I looked closer, something caught my eye. In the shadows, toward the rear of the car, I saw movement. Two other figures were hanging back, each holding what looked like metal pipes. They were trying to stay out of sight, but the glow from my headlights was just enough to catch them. The realization hit me like a punch to the gut. This wasn't a broken down car or some freak accident. It was a setup. I'd heard stories like this, but they always felt like urban legends, something you tell to spook newbies. Yet here I was, staring right at it. My heart started pounding as I took it all in. The nervous guy at my window, the shadows behind the car, the pipes. I kept my expression calm, not wanting to give away that I was on to them. I told the man I'd radio for help and started reaching for the CB, acting like I was just going to call it in. But his face changed, tightening, like he knew that wasn't part of his plan. His voice got louder, more desperate, insisting that I had to help now or she'd die. That was all I needed to hear. My instincts kicked in, and I shoved the truck back into gear, barely taking my foot off the brake before slamming it onto the gas. The guy's hand shot out like he was trying to grab the window or something, but I was already moving. My tires screeched as I pulled back onto the road, glancing in the mirror just in time to see him and his buddies running after me. One of them even swung the pipe, hitting nothing but air as I sped away. I felt my pulse racing, my hands tight on the wheel, and I didn't ease up on the gas until I'd put a good mile between us. But that's when I saw it. Headlights in my mirror. They'd gotten back into the car and were now tailing me, their lights small and distant but steady, following my every move. I kept one eye on the road and the other on those headlights, my mind racing. I knew the next town wasn't for miles, and there were no turnoffs, no places to pull over safely. The highway was just this long, dark line stretching into nowhere, and I was alone. Every time I thought they might be falling back, those lights would surge forward again, keeping right on my tail. I didn't know what they were planning, but I could feel it, this relentless tension crawling up my spine. It felt like they were just waiting for me to mess up or slow down enough for them to catch up. My truck might be big and heavy, but it wasn't exactly built for speed, and I started worrying they'd pull up alongside me any second. Then, just as suddenly as they'd started following me, they disappeared. I didn't see them turn off or slow down. They were just gone. 1 second the headlights were there, and the next, I was staring at empty road in my mirror. But that wasn't any relief. If anything, it made me feel worse. I was still miles from any real civilization, and now I had no idea where they went or what they were planning. I kept expecting them to pop back out of nowhere, maybe from the side of the road up ahead, but the highway stayed empty. The rest of the drive was like some twisted game, where I couldn't shake the feeling I was being watched, stalked. I made it to my stop without any more signs of them, but I felt like I'd left a piece of myself back there on that dark stretch of road. When I finally reached the drop-off point, I thought I'd feel safe, like I'd made it through. But that uneasiness just wouldn't let go. I parked, stepped out, and my legs felt shaky, like the adrenaline hadn't fully worn off. I kept looking over my shoulder, half expecting that old beat-up car to roll up any second. Even as I talked to the staff, signing papers and doing the usual checks, I could barely focus. My mind kept replaying that guy's face, his strange mix of desperation and calculation. I knew he'd been lying, but part of me kept wondering just how far he'd have gone if I'd actually gotten out of the truck. Later, as I was settling in at a nearby motel, I tried to make sense of it. I'd been lucky, and I knew it. Out here on these empty highways, you don't always get a second chance. I thought about reporting it, but what would I even say? That some guy with a junk car and a creepy story tried to lure me out? That I'd seen 2 figures in the shadows with pipes? It felt like the kind of thing they'd just brush off, tell me I was imagining it or paranoid. I slept with a chair propped under the door handle that night, but it wasn't exactly restful. Even now, I keep replaying that scene in my head, wondering what would have happened if I'd been just a bit slower, or if I hadn't noticed those shadows. Since that night, I haven't been able to shake this feeling, like a shadow that follows me every time I'm out on a dark road alone. I've heard stories from other truckers since then, similar encounters, setups that seemed harmless at first but turned dangerous fast. Some of them have had even closer calls, and a few weren't as lucky as me. I used to brush those stories off as just talk, but now I know better. It's strange how quickly your perspective can shift after something like that. I trust my instincts a lot more now, and I don't stop for anyone out there at night unless it's an absolute emergency. Every once in a while, when I'm out on a long haul, I'll pass an old car pulled over or see someone waving, and I get that chill down my spine all over again. Maybe they're just stranded, maybe they really need help, but I don't risk it. Not anymore. That night on the Texas road, I was a split second away from stepping right into whatever they had planned, and I still don't know what would have happened if I had. It's a weird feeling, knowing you narrowly missed something bad but never really knowing how bad. All I know is that, whatever their plan was, they didn't get what they wanted from me that night. And I don't plan to give anyone another chance like that ever again. Stranded in the storm with a silent passenger. I've been driving trucks for nearly 20 years, and in all those miles, I've seen some pretty strange things. But nothing like what happened that night in Montana. I was pushing through a remote mountain pass, trying to get ahead of a brutal thunderstorm that had rolled in out of nowhere. It was late, probably around 2 a.m., and the rain was coming down so hard that even my high beams couldn't cut through it. Lightning was flashing in the distance, casting shadows that seemed to twist and move in ways that didn't feel natural. I kept telling myself it was just the storm messing with my eyes, but it didn't shake this uneasy feeling that had settled in my gut. Then, just as I was about to round a bend, my headlights caught something. No, someone, standing right at the edge of the road. At first, I thought it might be an animal, but as I got closer, I saw it was a person. A man, soaking wet, with tattered clothes clinging to him, holding up a thumb for a ride. I can't even explain why I stopped. Normally, I wouldn't pick up a hitchhiker, especially out here in the middle of nowhere, especially in that storm. But there was something almost desperate about him. I figured maybe his car had broken down, and he'd been out there for hours. Against my better judgment, I pulled over and let him climb into the passenger seat. He didn't say a word as he got in, just nodded once in thanks and settled in, still shivering, eyes fixed on the dashboard like it was the most interesting thing in the world. I tried asking where he was headed, but he didn't respond, didn't even look my way. The silence was heavy, mixed with the rhythmic pounding of rain against the windshield and the occasional rumble of thunder. I thought about pressing him, but there was something in his expression that stopped me cold. His face was blank, almost hollow. No anger, no fear, just empty. The kind of look that makes your skin prickle for reasons you can't explain. We drove like that for a good 10 or 15 miles, with him just sitting there, soaked to the bone but not saying a damn thing. I kept glancing over, half expecting him to start talking or at least give me some kind of sign that he wasn't completely out of it. But he never did. Then, as we came up to a clearing, I turned my head for a split second to check the road ahead. When I looked back to where he was sitting, he was gone. Just gone. The first thing I did was slam on the brakes, which nearly sent the rig skidding on the wet road. My heart was hammering, and I kept looking around, thinking maybe he'd slipped out without me noticing. But that didn't make any sense. We were in the middle of nowhere, with no buildings, no other cars, just thick forest all around. I leaned over to feel the seat, expecting it to be soaked from his clothes. But it was completely dry, like no one had ever been sitting there. I touched the fabric again, almost to convince myself I wasn't imagining it, but it was bone dry, not a single drop. I sat there for a minute, my mind racing, trying to make sense of it. I started questioning if I'd even picked him up at all. Maybe the storm, the darkness, had messed with my head, but then I remembered every detail. The look on his face, the way he never spoke, how cold he looked sitting there, staring at the dash. I'd felt that weird tension in the cab, that heaviness, and I knew I hadn't imagined that. I took a deep breath, tried to shake it off, and finally got the truck moving again. But every time I glanced at the empty seat, a chill crept up my spine. I couldn't get his face out of my mind, that blank, hollow stare, like he wasn't really there. I kept driving, white-knuckling the wheel, trying to focus on the road, but I couldn't shake this feeling that I wasn't alone, even though I knew damn well the passenger seat was empty. I swear, out of the corner of my eye, I kept catching glimpses, like maybe he was still sitting there, just barely outside my line of sight. After a while, the storm started to ease up, and I thought I could finally breathe. But then I heard this faint sound, almost like whispering, barely louder than the hum of the engine. It didn't make any sense, but I could have sworn it was coming from right there, in the cab with me. I gripped the wheel harder, trying to ignore it, trying to convince myself it was just the wind or my mind playing tricks on me. But deep down, I knew something wasn't right. The whispering got louder, and it felt like words, though I couldn't understand them. Just a low, unsettling murmur filling the silence. At that point, I was honestly starting to panic. I was gripping the wheel so tight my knuckles were white, and every nerve in my body was on edge. I tried turning up the radio to drown out the sound, but it didn't help. The whispering just kept going, this weird, muffled murmur that seemed to seep right into my head. I could feel my heart pounding, my skin crawling. Every instinct was screaming at me to stop the truck, get out, do something. But we were still miles from any town, with nothing but dark road ahead and forest pressing in on both sides. Finally, I reached a spot where I could pull off onto the shoulder, and I did just that, slamming the brakes harder than I meant to. I sat there in silence, catching my breath, almost afraid to move. I glanced over at the passenger seat, half expecting to see that figure back there, just sitting, staring at me. But the seat was empty. The whole cab was quiet, except for the soft ticking of the engine cooling down. It was like whatever had been in there with me had vanished, leaving behind only that lingering sense of dread. I can't explain it, but something in that moment felt wrong, like the silence was too thick, too heavy, as if the air itself was holding onto something unnatural. I stayed there on the side of the road for what felt like forever, just trying to calm down, hoping that whatever had happened was over. The rain had slowed to a drizzle by then, and I figured I'd just get moving again, put this whole thing behind me. But the moment I shifted the truck back into gear, I caught a glimpse in the rearview mirror that made my stomach drop. In the faint glow of my taillights, I thought I saw a figure standing by the back of the truck, barely visible in the rain, but unmistakably there. Same tattered clothes, same hollow stare, just watching me. I looked over my shoulder, expecting to see him right there, but when I turned around, he was gone. I felt like I'd been punched in the gut. My hands started shaking, and I could barely breathe. I didn't wait to find out if he'd reappear. I floored it, speeding down the mountain road like I was being chased. The whole way down, I kept glancing in the mirrors, half expecting to see him pop up again. But there was nothing. Only when I finally reached the edge of town did I feel that suffocating sense of dread start to lift. Though even now, I can't get his face out of my mind. After I finally made it to town, I pulled into a truck stop and parked, feeling like I'd barely made it out of that mountain pass in one piece. My body was drained, like every bit of energy had been sucked right out of me. I sat there for a while, staring into the dark, trying to process what had just happened. I kept telling myself it was just the storm, the stress, maybe even the lack of sleep. But deep down, I knew that wasn't it. There was no explaining what I'd seen, that emptiness in his eyes, or the way he just disappeared without a trace. Since that night, I've taken that mountain route a few more times, but I never felt quite right driving through there again. Every time I see rain coming down, especially at night, I tense up, half expecting to see that figure waiting on the roadside, arm raised for a ride. It's been months, but I still find myself glancing over at the passenger seat every now and then, just to make sure it's empty. People say truckers see strange things on the road, but this was something different. Something I still can't explain, and probably never will. Abandoned bag on the side of the highway. It was around midnight, and I was driving through one of those long, empty stretches of highway in Arizona where it's just you, the stars, and the road. Nothing but flat, endless darkness around. I've been trucking for years, so I know these kinds of roads, but there was something about that night that felt off. Maybe it was the silence, or how the headlights only seemed to carve out a small patch of road in the vast blackness, but I was already on edge. That's when I spotted it, a duffel bag lying alone on the shoulder, illuminated just briefly by my headlights. Usually, I wouldn't stop, but this time something about that bag made me curious. I mean, why would anyone leave something that big out here, in the middle of nowhere? I slowed down and pulled over a few yards past it. The road was deserted, dead quiet, with no lights in sight. As I walked up to the bag, every step felt heavier, like my gut was telling me to get back in the truck, but my curiosity was too strong. I reached down to unzip it, wondering if it was just camping gear someone forgot, or maybe a bunch of random junk. But right as my hand touched the zipper, I felt this rush of air from behind me, like someone was coming in fast. Instinct kicked in. I threw myself to the side just in time to see a man, his face wild and shadowed, thrusting something sharp at where I'd just been standing. My heart was pounding so hard I could barely think. I stumbled backward, trying to regain my balance, and for a split second, our eyes met. His look was inhuman. There was this raw, crazed rage in his eyes that made my blood run cold. He looked desperate, like he'd do anything to stop me from opening that bag. That's when I noticed movement in the shadows around him. At least 2 or 3 other figures, just standing there, half hidden by the darkness, watching. They weren't saying anything, just staring. I didn't have time to process it all. My body just took over. I turned and sprinted back toward my truck. When I reached the cab, I practically threw myself inside, slamming the door shut behind me and locking it in one frantic motion. My hands were shaking as I jammed the keys into the ignition and floored it. The headlights flashed over the road as I sped off, and in the rearview mirror, I caught one last glimpse of the figures on the road. They had moved out of the shadows now, all of them watching me, their faces barely visible but enough for me to see they were angry, or maybe just waiting. Once I was a few miles down the road, I started to catch my breath, but the adrenaline still had me wired. I couldn't shake the image of those people just standing there, like they'd been waiting for me to stop. Part of me thought maybe I just imagined it, like it was some stress-induced hallucination. But then I glanced down at my hands on the wheel and realized they were smeared with something. It was dark, sticky. At first, I thought it was oil or grease from the bag, but it didn't feel right. The smell was sharp, metallic. That's when I realized it was blood. I couldn't figure out how it got on me, but it made my skin crawl. I tried wiping it off on my jeans, but the feeling of it clung to me. I decided to push on to the next rest stop, just wanting to get somewhere with lights, people, anything that felt normal. By the time I pulled in, it was almost deserted, just one other car parked at the far end, its interior dark. I jumped out, still feeling that jittery urgency, and as I moved to close the truck door, I noticed something strange. There were smears on the door handle, like someone had been trying to pry it open. Long, dark streaks that looked like finger marks, dragged down as if someone had tried to hold on as I'd driven off. I stood there staring at those marks, every hair on my body standing on end. It was like they'd been trying to get in the whole time I was driving, clawing at the handle. The blood on my hands made sense now. But how the hell had they kept up with me? I'd floored it, sped away as fast as that rig could go. None of it added up, but I couldn't stop replaying those shadowed figures in my mind, standing so still, watching. I tried to brush it off as some sort of crazy coincidence or maybe some trick of my headlights, but deep down, I knew that didn't explain the bloody streaks or the smear on my hands. I went inside the rest stop to wash up, thinking maybe I'd finally be able to clear my head. But when I looked at myself in the mirror, I barely recognized the guy staring back. My face was pale, my eyes wide and bloodshot, like I hadn't slept in days. I scrubbed my hands until they were red, but the feeling didn't leave me. As I walked back out to the truck, I noticed how quiet it was, like the silence back on the highway. That's when I heard it. Soft, dragging footsteps, slow and steady, coming from behind the rest stop building. I didn't wait to see who or what it was. I ran back to my truck, jumped inside, and locked the doors as fast as I could. My heart was hammering, and I just sat there, gripping the steering wheel, watching the rear-view mirrors. Nothing moved. There were no footsteps anymore, just that eerie, empty silence all around. But then I noticed something in the side mirror, a faint figure standing at the edge of the rest stoplights, almost out of sight. It was too far to make out any details, but they weren't moving, just standing there, like they were watching me. I couldn't shake the feeling that it was one of those people from the highway, maybe the same one who'd lunged at me. I didn't stick around to find out. I put the truck in gear and got out of there as fast as I could, not caring about speed limits or anything else. I drove straight through to my next stop, a good couple hours away, without looking back. But even as the miles ticked by, I kept catching glimpses in the mirrors, feeling like there was always something just out of sight, following me. By the time I reached the next stop, I was exhausted, my nerves completely shot. I tried to tell myself it was just my imagination, but when I stepped out of the truck, I saw something that made my stomach drop. A fresh set of smeared fingerprints along the side of the door, trailing down the handle, exactly like before. I barely slept that night. I kept thinking about how someone, or something, had managed to keep up with me, even after I'd driven so far and so fast. It didn't make sense. Every time I closed my eyes, I'd see that wild look in the man's face, and those figures in the dark, just watching. By morning, I felt like I'd been hit by a truck myself, but I needed to check the truck, see if I'd missed something, maybe a sign that this was all in my head. But when I walked around the rig, I noticed a new detail that I hadn't seen in the dark. Small scratches near the door handle, almost like claw marks. They were thin, jagged, not deep but enough to catch the light. I thought about calling someone, maybe reporting it, but what was I going to say? That a group of strangers had tried to get into my truck and somehow followed me across miles of highway? I'd sound like a lunatic. So I just decided to keep it to myself, chalking it up as some bizarre, one-off experience. But every now and then, especially on those long, dark stretches of road, I still get that feeling, a chill running down my spine, like I'm being watched. And every time I check my mirrors, there's always this shadow in the corner of my eye that I can never quite make out. Since that night, I've been hyper-aware every time I pull over, especially on empty stretches of road. I've heard all sorts of stories from other truckers about strange things on the highway, but this was something else. A few days later, I found myself checking online, trying to see if anyone else had experienced anything similar, maybe seen that same group of people or abandoned bag. But I came up empty. No reports, no similar stories. Just a ton of unanswered questions that kept swirling around in my head. It made me feel almost paranoid, like maybe they knew I'd tell someone, so they'd covered their tracks. I don't know what was in that bag, and honestly, I don't want to know anymore. Whatever it was enough to drive someone to attack a stranger in the middle of the night and chase me down like that. Since then, I've been sticking to well-lit, busy stops and trying to ignore that constant feeling of eyes on me. But deep down, I know they're still out there, somewhere on those dark highways, waiting for the next curious person who decides to pull over and take a look. The mysterious SOS signal in the wilderness. I was on a long haul, cutting through a dense stretch of forest around midnight. The road was dead empty, just me and the hum of the truck's engine. It was one of those nights where everything around seemed to absorb any light from my headlights. There was something almost hypnotic about the dark, the trees pressing in on both sides. Just as I was settling into the quiet rhythm, something caught my eye, a faint blinking light through the trees, barely noticeable. I slowed down, squinting to get a better look. It was flashing in a pattern. 3 short flashes, 3 long, 3 short, an SOS signal. Against every instinct screaming at me to keep going, I found myself pulling over. It didn't make sense, but something about that light felt urgent, like someone needed help. I grabbed my flashlight, stepped out into the cold night air, and started toward the light. The trees swallowed me up quickly, the road disappearing behind me. The light was close, maybe 50 yards in, but each step felt heavier, my gut telling me I was making a mistake. I kept moving though, following that flickering glow. Just when I thought I was getting close, the light blinked out. Dead silence followed, pressing down around me, so thick it felt like I couldn't even hear my own breath. My flashlight's beam cut through the darkness, but there was nothing, no one. Then, crunching sounds started up, like footsteps shuffling through the leaves. They seemed to come from every direction, circling me. I froze, straining to listen, heart pounding so hard I thought it'd give me away. My mind raced, realizing I was far from the road, alone, surrounded by who knows what in this pitch-black forest. The footsteps grew louder, closing in around me. I could feel the hairs on the back of my neck stand up as I tried to pinpoint where they were coming from, but it was impossible. Every time I turned, it sounded like they were shifting, moving just out of sight. Panic kicked in hard, and all I could think about was getting out of there as fast as possible. I whipped around and started running, stumbling over roots and branches, flashlight bouncing in my grip. I could barely see, but I kept my focus on where I thought the road would be, hoping I wasn't going deeper into the woods by mistake. Just when I thought I might have outrun whatever, or whoever, was out there, I heard something close behind, like a low whisper or murmur. I didn't dare look back. My heart was hammering, and I was so close to the edge of the woods when I finally spotted the faint glint of my truck's headlights through the trees. I made a mad dash for it, practically diving into the driver's seat and slamming the door shut. I fumbled with the lock, breathing hard, feeling a surge of relief at the small barrier between me and whatever was lurking out there. I barely had a second to catch my breath before I noticed movement at the edge of the trees. Shadows, at least 3 or 4 of them, were standing just outside the tree line, too far to make out any details, but close enough for me to know they were watching. My hands shook as I reached for the ignition, twisting the key and praying my truck would start without any issues. As soon as the engine roared to life, I threw it into gear, my only thought being to get as far away from that place as possible. As I sped down the road, I glanced in my rearview mirror, half expecting to see those figures following me. Instead, I saw the faint glow of that same SOS signal flash on again, blinking through the trees, just as it had before. It was like it was resetting, waiting for the next person to come along and get lured in. I couldn't shake the feeling that whatever I just stumbled upon wasn't done, that it was some kind of trap set up for anyone curious enough to take the bait. I drove for hours, only stopping once I was miles away, too freaked out to even consider pulling over until I was far from those woods. Even after I was a safe distance away, my mind couldn't let go of what I'd seen. The shadows at the tree line, the way that light had blinked back on like nothing had happened, almost as if it had never been meant for me specifically, but for anyone who might pass by. I started to replay everything in my head, questioning if I'd actually seen what I thought I did, but every time I remembered the feeling of those footsteps circling me, a cold dread settled back in. I never reported it. Who would I even tell? I thought about it plenty, but every time I tried to put it into words, it sounded like something out of a bad horror story, not something that could actually happen. But I know what I saw, and more than that, I know what I felt. Since then, I haven't taken that route at night. I avoid it altogether if I can. There's just something wrong about that stretch of woods, something waiting. And even now, every once in a while on a dark, empty road, I catch myself looking for a faint light blinking through the trees, hoping I'll never see it again.